screen, and then we will get going. So you'll recall that the first time we focused on the underlying problems, the underlying causes behind this urban-rural divide. And tonight's focus will be, okay, what can we do about it? So that's where we'll be centering the conversation. I want to begin with a really swift review of those 6 underlying causes. I'm not going to discuss each one, but just to bring us back up to speed. The first was that the economy has failed most Americans, around 80%, and that it's been particularly bad for rural communities and working folks in rural places. The second was that this economic failure, combined with a lot of other factors, has helped to generate a widespread anger towards elites, with elites being defined by really the right, but being understood by a lot of rural people as liberals, Democrats, urbanites, intellectuals, experts. The third was the belief, kind of as part of a larger sense of reticence or anti-government feelings, that regulations don't help everyday people, and that the government's involvement in our lives is generally intrusive and ineffective. The fourth was the sense of many rural people feeling like strangers in their own land, which was the term that Arlie Hochschild coined for her research with rural people in Louisiana. Very much alienated from much of mainstream culture. The fifth underlying cause was the shift, of pretty profound shift in the orientation, the priorities, the language, the associations of the Democratic Party, from one primarily focused on working class people to one much more comfortable with and steeped in elites, especially economic elites, but also cultural elites, and how that has helped to sustain and exacerbate the divide. And the sixth cause we discussed was this incrementalism, the approach that the Democratic Party has taken for the last basically 40 years, and the pervasive myth that we must come down in the middle, the moderate middle, to win elections and to govern. So that's a very quick synopsis of our whole hour and a half last time. Now I want to shift us to this question of where do we go from here? So the first question, and this has come up a couple of times in other forums that I've done around the divide, where people say, okay, maybe you're right, but really, why should we care? I mean, what these people, these Trump supporters, really, is there anything to be gained by trying to understand where they're coming from and empathize with them? So David Wong, I attached this article or I gave it to Bucky to attach in the email. It's part of the Rural Urban Divide Guidebook. It's titled How Half of America Lost Its Effing Mind. And he, growing up in a rural area and now being a very liberal writer, he says, it feels good to dismiss people, to mock them, to write them off as deplorables. But you might as well take time to try to understand them, because I'm telling you, they'll still be around long after Trump is gone. And I think we're seeing pretty clear evidence of that in a lot of different ways. Van Jones, some of you may know, he was briefly President Obama's green jobs czar in the first administration. He was drummed out on false charges and insinuations, mostly by Glenn Beck. But Van Jones, an African-American scholar and activist, has made a career of trying to understand people who are very different from him and break through the divide. And he said, progressives do pretty well embracing the historically marginalized, but not so well embracing the newly marginalized or about to be marginalized. And then this last, I had a conversation today with somebody who was not on our first call, but who watched the presentation. And he's a friend. He's a financial advisor here in Abingdon. He was born and raised in Grundy. And after he and I talked, he's, I would say, fiscally conservative, socially liberal, kind of halfway between Democrat and Republican. And he sent me a screen post of what he put on his Facebook site on election night 2016. Going to bed, but wow. Democrats asking how and thinking this was about racism. No, it was because they abandoned the little guys and are only for asset prices and global trade in the eyes of the common worker. The same counties that overwhelmingly elected President Obama flipped in 4 years. Democrats, if you win, you need to stop supporting political oligopolies and regulatory environments created by the large companies. Otherwise, this would not have been close. To corporate America, the strategy of producing it cheap somewhere else and bringing your product back to sell won't work forever, but sadly, Republicans won't fix this either, as the money in politics makes this impossible. So I share this because here's a guy who's relatively conservative, liberal certainly in a number of respects, but who, as a local person, nailed this in so many ways 4 years before I put together this presentation. So I thought it was a very astute observation. So that's just a little context to get us in the frame of mind. I want to talk now about what do we do about it. And my suggestions about how we move forward are in 3 categories. I'm suggesting that we, as liberals, as Democrats, as progressives, need to think differently, we need to act differently, and we need to talk differently. So I'm going to spend a little time in each of those areas before we move into the Q&A. Thinking differently begins with the recognition that many rural people, whatever you think, many, many rural people believe that the economy and the government have failed them, and that the wider liberal culture utterly disrespects them. You might remember from our session last week, the woman who was quoted in Erica Edelson's book as talking about how it might be hard to understand how people who were from the dominant race and the dominant religion could feel under siege, but in fact they do. And this is part of the point here. So we need to put aside our sense of the way we think people ought to feel and ought to believe, and just accept that a big chunk of our neighbors and a big chunk of people across rural America sense that the economy has failed them, which is true enough, that the government has failed them, which is maybe more mixed, and that the liberal culture disrespects them. And as I said last time, one place to go a lot deeper with that and the other causes is the guidebook that we've been sharing along the way. Now, how do we think differently? I'm going to offer a couple, 3 different ways of rethinking our assumptions. Now, I'm on the call assuming that most people on the call would identify as either liberal or Democrat, and perhaps a goodly number as progressives as well. And I call myself a progressive more than a liberal. In 2017, not long after Trump was elected, actually in late 2016, I put out a call to a handful of folks, and over the next 8-9 months, culminating in June of 2017, a group of about a dozen of us from Southwest Virginia developed a rural progressive platform. People came from the Montgomery County area, from the coal fields, from Grayson and Carroll County. Robert Kell, who's on this call, was one of the people involved. And we developed this rural progressive platform, which is linked in the guidebook. And I'm not going to go deeply into it, but I want to just touch on the 3 fundamental pillars that the rural progressive platform is built around: land, livelihood, and community. We go into some detail. The platform, by the way, is not very long. It's about 4 pages, so it doesn't take you a whole lot of time to read through it. But in terms of land, we talk about how rural regions share a sense that nature is part of how we meet our needs. We feed ourselves, create jobs and livelihoods. That the mountains, forests, valleys, and streams are a practical part of our lives. And this is an important thing because as we talked about last time, many of the people whose lives are most closely attached to the ecosystem, who need a healthy, functioning landscape and environment, are people who resist and sometimes loathe environmentalists and environmental policies. And part of it, we believe, is because a lot of rural people see the land, see the forest, see the creeks, see the bayous, see the countryside as a part of how we get along, how we make our living. So we suggest that progressive policies need to start making partners of folks who live from the land, rather than just looking to regulate and restrict the bad stuff that happens on the land. In terms of livelihoods, which flows very much again from land, the sense is that, as we say here, the sense of livelihood, of taking care of our own needs through hard, sometimes dangerous work, of being self-reliant. This is still very strong in most rural people, even rural people who do not right now connect directly to the land. These are folks that maybe aren't making their living anymore, but that sense of the land and livelihood is still deep there. If we seem to resent people telling us how to manage our land, it's because we do a lot of the work that enables so many others to eat well, be warm, and live comfortably. So again, some of that sense of resentment towards elites in other places who maybe aren't growing food, harvesting timber, producing energy. We suggest that working men and women have to be the foundation of the broader progressive movement, that it includes not only a focus on the rights that are so critical and under fire right now, but also the responsibilities that people have. That's the second pillar. And the third is community. Small towns and rural places, like many bigger cities, have seen community eroded by empty storefronts, consolidated schools, addiction, and more. Even so, people in rural communities tend to set down roots in our place. So when we're told to just move to where the jobs are, what a lot of the experts and the pundits will suggest, we think it's a choice we shouldn't have to make. In rural areas, we believe that a caring local community offers the best means to support and help our neighbors. Some of that anti-government sense comes from that idea that we should take care of our own, not have people far away taking care of us. I'll just ask folks to remember to mute if you've just recently got on. So we've got some background noise. So if you could mute if you're not now speaking, that'd be great. You need somebody who's walking to mute if you can. Try to stop that background noise. Great. The idea behind community in the platform is that strengthening local community should be a central goal of progressive policies. And frankly, it usually is not. Progressive policies, like liberal policies, tend towards big solutions, big national and international solutions. And obviously, we need that in a number of areas and respects, like climate change. But there is this divide that I think a lot of people in rural communities still believe that the source of recovery from disaster all the way through to just caring for our basic needs should first and foremost be local. And I think we need to make that a part of our progressive policies. So those are some of the ideas behind the notion of a rural progressive platform. The second source of thought that I want to introduce in terms of how we might examine and consider this differently, think differently, comes again from Haney Lopez, who we mentioned last time. In his race-class fusion argument, he makes a very strong case that we've lost a lot of potential allies among rural people across the income spectrum, but particularly working folks, by somehow pitting race against class. We may not do that directly, but sometimes it appears to be that that's what we're doing. In his book and in his work, his book is more than just a book. It comes out of the experience of doing a lot of surveying and interviews, but also what's sometimes called deep canvassing around the country. They tested a lot of different messages to see what would work with that big chunk of Americans who are persuadable, who are neither solid left Bernie type people or Democrats or solid right, but they hold a mix of views. And they tested a range, and it's these race class messages like this one that they found to be the most successful. So you can see it here. They were talking about the question of how to bring people together and the issues of Medicare and Social Security. They said certain politicians and their greedy lobbyists hurt everyone by handing kickbacks to the rich, defunding our schools, and threatening seniors with cuts to Medicare and Social Security. Then they turn around and point the finger for hard times at poor families, Black people, and new immigrants. When we reject their scapegoating and come together across racial differences, we can make this a nation we're proud to leave all of our kids, whether we're white, Black, or brown, from down the street or across the globe. What he found with this kind of a message, and he had several examples in his book, he has those, is that this roughly 60% of the population that he believes are persuadable, 3 out of 5 preferred this message to so-called dog whistle messages, which are messages that are not overtly racist, but which imply that the problem is people who are different, people of a different race, immigrants, different color. Interestingly, he found that African Americans and other people of color also preferred this to messages that were more traditional, liberal, race-focused without mention of class. So it wasn't just working white people that resonated with this more, but African Americans and Latinos also found these messages to be more to their thinking. So this race-class message, which seems to cut across race and class, has its advantage of being very direct. It's not wishy-washy. So those are some of the ways, and there's a lot more ideas in the guidebook, that we can begin to reconsider how we think about these issues. I want to talk now about how we might act differently. We have an enormous trust problem. Democrats, liberals, progressives have a huge trust problem in rural areas and sort of in the larger debate among conservatives. And I'm by no means going to say that it's all our fault. Obviously, as I said last time, a lot of that comes from the long-term, 4-decade-old, extraordinarily well-funded effort to redefine Americans and to pit us against each other. No doubt about it. But that's where we are. And we are not going to win many people over unless we can begin to rebuild trust. And I think that one of the best ways we do that is by rebuilding community. So I have an image here of John Mullins. John Mullins and Martin Miles were 2 farmers from Lee County, Virginia, just in the Stickleyville area, who were among the very first tobacco farmers to start working with ASD back when I was with ASD, raising and selling organic produce through the Appalachian Harvest Food Hub network that we sent up. This is back in 2000. And I won't go into the details of that, but suffice to say that when we started reaching out to folks like John and Martin and others, we didn't say anything bad about tobacco. We didn't diss it as something that kills people. We didn't talk about its environmental problems, none of that. We just said, we think we have ways to sell organic produce that can make you as much or more money than tobacco if you're willing to give it a try. And that basic kind of message that was not impugning what they were doing and what they'd done their whole lives, but was inviting them into a different way of doing it, really worked with an awful lot of farmers, including some very, very conservative folks. I'm going to go back to Van Jones here. I love this quote because I think it gets to this question about acting differently. He says, and this is in his book, Beyond the Messy Truth, "I'm not calling for unity and bipartisanship for its own sake. Elite-approved, top-down bipartisanship got us into this situation in the first place. We've had enough bipartisanship of the elites, by the elites, and for the elites. To make any progress, I'm searching for a bottom-up bipartisanship, the kind of alliances that ordinary people discover when they reach out to solve the deadly serious problems that land on their doorsteps. That kind of solidarity emerges, however conditionally, when good people help one another as neighbors, as Americans, as human beings. Now, I think this is harder than ever. With the last 4 years in particular of Trump, it's just daunting, as people on this call have shared with me. It's daunting to even break through with neighbors at this point. I think it's harder than it's ever been. But I think Van Jones is still right. What we're looking for is a bottom-up form of solidarity. You can call it bipartisanship or nonpartisanship if you want, rather than just saying it's two-party compromise. So what are a couple of other examples? These truly are just examples to think about, because in every community, in every place, it can be something very different. But here's what I'm suggesting. Part of overcoming the mistrust, part of rebuilding a sense that we're all in this together, won't come just from words, although we'll be talking about language and words in a minute, but it will come from actions. And I know a lot of you on this call, and I know a lot of you already are deeply engaged in the world and in your community doing good stuff. But what I'm suggesting is that we think about taking on projects that are clearly good for people in the community, that are essentially non-political or at least nonpartisan, but do them as liberals, as progressives, as the Appalachian Peace Education Center, or as the Smith County Democratic Party, or as the Young Appalachian Patriots, but to do it with our brand, as it were, out there. So here's an example of a great one. This is something that's emerged in Eastern Kentucky and Southern West Virginia. There was a brief attempt at it a couple of years ago in East Tennessee. I'd love to see it in Southwest Virginia. It's this idea of pharmacy, where healthcare professionals work with groups of local farmers to actually literally write prescriptions for local healthy food, like produce. And then they do this with low-income and working clients who go to health clinics, who more often than not struggle with a healthy diet for a variety of reasons. With these prescriptions, they go to the local farmer's market or the local farm stand. They get the produce. What we found from about 5 years of experience in West Virginia in particular is that not only do local farmers get new buyers, not only do local people use those prescriptions to buy local produce, but it actually begins to impact buying habits and eating habits. This is the proverbial win-win-win. Better health for people who struggle with good health and good eating, a new market for local farmers, and a way that we can be more oriented towards prevention rather than just treating sickness. Imagine now if a local, avowedly liberal or progressive group took on the task of starting a pharmacy program, bringing together the healthcare professionals you need and the farmers you need. It's one of just innumerable examples of how we might begin to persuade our neighbors that we're not as bad as they think we are, that we're not just about all the negative associations that the right has been able to put on liberals. Another more complex example, but certainly something that could be worked out over a long time, comes from Eastern Kentucky, where MESA, a group many of you know, Mountain Association for Community Economic Development, years ago started an on-bill financing program where individuals who are low income, living in drafty homes, paying $250, $300 a month, trying to stay warm, got their homes retrofitted, their homes or trailers, with double pane windows, with insulation, et cetera, and they paid for it from the savings on the utility bill. So they didn't have to go into an interest-laden debt. They simply got a better, warmer, drier home and paid for it over 5 to 8 years through that savings. Now, again, that's a fairly complex and sophisticated thing for a small group of folks to take on, but it's an example of the kind of project that almost nobody could argue with, except maybe the utility company, that could build trust, could have real positive impact in the community, and begin to help break down these barriers. It's an approach that sometimes is known as a working landscapes approach as well, where we, instead of focusing on the bad stuff that we have to stop, the environmental abuses, we focus on incentives for good practices. Right now, a handful of states, including Maryland, Colorado, California, and several others, have adopted soil health legislation that incentivizes, that pays farmers to follow a set of practices that help pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in their soil. Those are very sensible ways to both impact climate change and provide for healthier, more resilient farming practices as well. There's a small group of us and a larger statewide group in Virginia called the Soil Health Coalition that's working on this very thing right now. What if farmers throughout Southwest Virginia, Southside Virginia, Southeastern Virginia, below Petersburg, what if they identified liberals and progressives as the people who are trying to get laws passed that will pay them to make the adjustments they need to have healthy soil and carbon sequestration, rather than, as they now often associate us, as environmentalists who are trying to tell them how to run their farm. Just another set of ideas. And then, I don't need to say much about this, but the whole notion of supporting farms, farmers, and the local economy through farmers markets. A simple way that many of you, probably most of you, do in your individual buying habits. But what if you teamed up with the farmers market in Glade or in Marion or in Abingdon as a group to say, what help do you need? What are your issues? How can we help you build a broader customer base or anything else that is an issue? It could really begin to shift the perception of who we are as liberals, progressives, and Democrats. And the last area I want to talk about, and then we'll open it up to conversation, is I want to suggest that we talk differently. And I'm going to go into 4 specific things, but generally speaking, I'm talking about, first of all, talking less but saying more, using everyday language rather than jargon, and being concrete and particular rather than abstract. Now, I want to come back to Erica Edelson, who has become a long-distance mentor and colleague for me. She wrote the book Beyond Contempt. I couldn't possibly recommend a book more than this. It's fantastic. But from her book, I want to read, it's a fairly long passage, so bear with me. But before I read her quote, I want to read an individual she quotes in her book. And there's lots of folks like this. So here it is. I'm a white guy. I'm a well-educated person who enjoys art house movies, coffee houses, and classic blues. And yet, I find that some of the alt-right stuff exerts a pull even on me. Even though I'm smart and informed enough to see through it, it's seductive because I'm not a person with any power or privilege, and yet I am constantly bombarded with messages telling me that I'm a cancer, I'm a problem, everything is my fault. I'm very lower middle class. I've never owned a new car. I do my own home repairs, and I try to save money as much as I can. I cut my own grass, wash my own clothes, buy my clothes from Walmart. I have no clue how I will ever be able to retire. But oh, brother, to hear the media tell it, I'm just drowning in unearned power and privilege, and America will be a much brighter, more loving, more peaceful nation when I finally just keel over and die. Trust me, after all that, some of the alt-right stuff feels like a warm, soothing bath, a safe space, if you will. I recoil from the uglier stuff, but some of it, the, quote, hey, white guys, are actually okay, you know, be proud of yourself. That stuff is really very seductive, and it's only with some intellectual effort that I can resist the pull. It baffles me that more people on the left can't understand this, can't see how they're just feeding the growth of this stuff. So Erica Edelson has lots of people in her research and book like this who are talking about it. And she kind of sums it up in this way about the language of contempt that she feels consistently comes from the left, basically from liberals and Democrats. These are the voices of ordinary conservatives, not right-wing operatives, and they are beaming us a very urgent message. Whether it's labeling them bigots or denigrating their lifestyle, religion, or intelligence, liberal contempt is helping to bring the long simmering culture war to a rolling boil and pushing conservatives deeper into Trump's corner. So shifting beyond this question of contempt and moving beyond contempt, I'm going to close with something I've been using the last 7, 8, 9 months, maybe the last year, which is maybe it's kind of reductionist, but it's my 4 guiding principles for communicating in the countryside. And I honestly think these are pretty good for most folks. So the first, again, as I said, is don't talk so much. We need to listen more, and we need to get to the point. Now, I want to show an example of this, and I'll come back to the second one. In October of 2016, a month before the election, a merger was proposed between AT&T and Time-Warner. And Hillary Clinton took 4 days to make a statement. And when she did make her statement, this is a small excerpt from her statement. Secretary Clinton said, "I think it raises questions and concerns, and they should be looked into." She opined that it was appropriate for Congress to hold hearings on the matter and said further, "So I'm going to follow it closely, and obviously if I'm fortunate enough to be president, I will expect the government to conduct a very thorough analysis before making a decision." Hillary Clinton's statement altogether was somewhere on the order of 135 words. And at the end of it, it was very difficult to know if she had a position at all. Trump, serial liar, billionaire sort of, that he is, said this: "We will not approve this in my administration because it's too much concentration of power in the hands of too few." I can't think of a better example of a conservative and liberal standard bearer using the wrong language and the right language around a certain issue. So we need to try to talk a lot less, try to get to the point, and do a better job listening. This whole approach that Ian Haney Lopez and Erica Edelson talk about of deep canvassing, and I know some of you are familiar with it, is based on listening as the starting point. Second thing is to always use real world examples to explain and ground our ideas. That's usually not too difficult to do if we're just conscious of it, whether we're talking about healthcare or immigration or agriculture or monopolization. It's really pretty easy to find examples that you can lead with that sort of bring those bigger complex issues down to earth as a way to help people understand where you're coming from. And where possible, try to make those examples local. The third area is around avoiding jargon and talking points. This is a real bugaboo for me because so often I feel, especially politically active people on the liberal side, Lord in heaven, so many just talk in talking points. And it just becomes, I think, numbing, if not repulsive. And what I want to say is whatever the issue it is, whatever it is we're trying to talk about, think of the person we're talking to as a neighbor and think of yourself as a neighbor to them rather than being an activist trying to persuade them. And the last, which kind of flows from that, is the fact that most people, and again, I think this is true across the board, but I'd surmise that it's even more so with folks in the country. Most people relate to the concrete and the particular, not the abstract and the general. In fact, when we as liberals Remember that we're entering conversations with our neighbors and with conservatives with already the baggage in their minds of being elites, of being intellectuals, of being people who are detached from the struggles and the challenges and the realities of ordinary working people. That's the perception, fair or not. Then when we come into that and we talk a great deal, and a great deal of our talk is either jargon or large abstraction, people tune us out. And I go even further to say that I think people see that as a sign of deception. They don't really think it's either condescension or deception. And so I want to say, as much as possible, let's be concrete, let's be very particular in what we're saying, and always err on the side of being straightforward, because I do think that over time builds trust. So that's my presentation for tonight. I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to conversation. And Bucky, with your help, you can pull things out of the chat box or help recognize people who want to make a comment or ask a question.
Okay. Does anybody have anything right now that they'd like to say in response to Anthony's presentation? Margaret Gregg.
This, I hope, relates. Would there be any advantage to considering talking with Morgan Griffith about this type of concern and accommodation and sincere hope for the future?
Margaret, are you asking if there's if it would make sense to bring this urban-rural divide question to Morgan Griffith?
Yes, among other things, as a serious national concern, and has specific relevance in Virginia. Mm-hmm. And he represents a big part of the population, perhaps, that we want to listen to more respectfully.
I don't know, Margaret. I mean, this whole is really designed for people on the liberal progressive side to help us kind of get out of our bubbles and rethink how we think, act, and talk. For somebody like Griffith, who is not particularly popular, nor do I think the lion's share of working folks in the region think of him as one of them, think of him as somebody that relates to them. I don't know what the impact would be. I think Griffith wins time after time because of the massive level of mistrust of Democrats, not because he has much allegiance. Now, whether or not he might agree with some of the points of this point of view, but I really don't know where we would go with that. It's a good question. I just don't know the answer.
Thank you.
Kel and Anita have mentioned something in the chat that's a concrete and specific issue. And Kel, since you've mentioned it first, why don't you talk about it? Which is, you brought up farmers markets, Anthony. Kel?
Can't hear.
Are you here, Kel?
Yeah, sorry. You brought up the pharmacy program. Oh, that would be a great thing if you can get physicians to do it. However, I do want to point out that people who use transit lack access to the farmers market on Saturdays because transit does not run on Saturdays. And a lot of people who ride transit live in affordable housing, and except for a very few of the affordable housing complexes, it's not really practical to walk to the farmers market. nor is it really practical to walk to, say, Blue Hills Market, where you can also buy produce. That's a real problem. And a lot of the places that are affordable housing, I also want to point out, aren't in places that have sidewalks. Oh, when you walk around Abingdon a lot, you find out about things like this. This whole walk Abingdon, pretty much walk Abingdon if you live in very specific parts of Abingdon.
Sure. So, Kel, in terms of the context of this, here's what I mean. Those are real issues, and I know that you've gone down that path a little bit because you talked to me about that during the campaign as well, and I no doubt it has financial implications to expand transit, which is already difficult to make work, and all that kind of stuff. But the truth is that the way we solve those problems is bringing people together in a very concerted effort to tackle it. Now, I don't know enough about it to know how we tackle it, who will resist it, what the arguments against it will be, but I know that the only way we're going to get around that and actually be able to get people from public housing and other neighborhoods to the farmers market is to grapple with this. So what if it was a avowedly liberal, progressive organization that took this on, met with the farmers market leadership and said, we would love to get you some more customers, here's what's blocking that, and then begins the process that might take a year or two or three, but in the end, if you succeed, then it's this liberal group that helped make it happen for ordinary working folks and for farmers. So that's kind of the thinking here.
Okay, anybody else?
I thought Kel's suggestion would sound like a great first project along these lines. As Anthony commented on, I think one of my concerns following the presentation was I just wondered if the Democratic Party in general is repairable.
Can I say no comment at this point, board?
Who is that?
No, it's a very legit question. It's a very legit question. So, and you know, having run in the 9th, I can tell you that some local Democratic parties are fantastic. They're full of life. They have people that are pushing the envelope in terms of the party itself, as well as deeply engaged in the community. They're doing innovative things. Other parties are hanging on by a thread with a mostly very old membership that is, you know, just trying to survive in a red environment. So locally, the parties have the full spectrum. At the state and national level, the Democrats, I think, feel like they've been playing defense for a long time, and so they don't tend to embrace these ideas. One thing the Democratic Party and liberals writ large, I think, have not done well is just agreeing that we need a long-term, soul-searching self-scrutiny to see what we've really done wrong. When here's an example, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of getting away from your point, but I have a very good friend and colleague from another state who told me that after Trump was elected, the work that he had been doing, which was kind of cutting edge work, was all of a sudden embraced by foundation elites. They had been sort of not giving him and his organization, their effort, the time of day for a long time. They'd been knocking on the door. All of a sudden after Trump, there was like this, oh my God, we never saw this coming. We must have missed something big. And so suddenly he had interview after interview with major foundations. Now, most of those foundations are run by liberal people, often Democrats. And after about 3 or 4 months of this courtship, as things kind of started to settle into the more typical partisan attacks, they stopped answering his calls and emails. They went from courting him to basically right back to where he'd been before. And so his conclusion was that this soul searching was so brief that they never really re-examined their funding priorities. And I think the same thing has been true of the Democratic Party. There's these brief moments where we think, maybe we should think twice about the way we've been doing this, but it doesn't last. And that's where I'd like to see a major change.
Robert Kell had a comment he wants to make.
Thank you. It's a question, Anthony. When I hear you say deep canvassing, concrete in particular, when I hear your response to Kell, what I'm really hearing is community organizing. And so I'm really wondering what is different about what you're suggesting versus, say, the work that a Virginia Organizing does, what other organizations have tried to do around community sort of buy-in and choosing issues and seeing those issues like one. So how does community organizing fit into this, and then how is what you're offering different?
That's a good point, Robert. So here's my sense of it, and this I'm going to be categorizing community organizing a bit. First of all, I'm definitely an advocate of it. I've done a fair bit of it myself over the years. I'm a big supporter of Virginia organizing and similar efforts that have gone on around the region for a while. Here's the basic difference that I think is true in general. Most community organizing fights that I've been involved with and that I know of are usually fighting bad things. It's people organizing around a crisis or around sometimes a long-term problem, but it's a long-term problem of sort of the denigration of some part of the community, or rights of people being taken away, or the threat of a really bad employer, an incinerator, or whatever. And an awful lot of community organizing fights, not all of them, but a lot of them are fights. They're fights to stop things or to alter the balance of power kind of at some kind of a civic or political level, all of which is essential. But what I'm talking about is picking things that have a reasonable chance of yielding pretty positive results that most people in the community would not argue with. A lot of community organizing battles are involve a wide range and a great diversity of people, but there's still a certain choosing sides in them. And you end up often taking on the very people that I'm suggesting we've lost and we need to win back, at least in some cases. So that's the fundamental difference. It is community organizing, but it's organizing around goals that can lead to tangible improvements in the community that most people would agree are good for folks. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, because I do have the same sense that sometimes our organizing efforts are not attractive to everyone in our community and disengage quite a few. And in fact, harm our efforts to build coalitions and power to get things done. I think but I think that might be the issues that we as progressive folks have said are really important because they need to be addressed in our community. And I think that's what we're wrestling with right now. But yeah, no, thank you.
So just to follow up on that. So for instance, when I was involved in the founding of the Coalition for Jobs and the Environment in 1990, and we had this notion that we would create an organization that was going to try to build a new economy where we didn't have to choose between jobs and the environment. But for whatever set of reasons, some of it was the people who were in leadership and on the board, some of it was the circumstances of the time. Fairly quickly, CJE became more of a traditional environmental organization, which is to say its dominant focus, its primary resources, and its reputation in the community was all around fighting bad stuff. There was incinerators, there was employers that were clear cutting, there was all kinds of things. It defaulted to that stopping the bad stuff. We then sort of did a take two and created ASD because we knew that CJA's work was critical, and it was essential work, but we wanted to try to create an organization that instead of focusing on fighting the bad stuff was focused on creating the better alternatives. And that's kind of another way to say the same thing I'm saying.
Okay, Kel said she has a question.
Hey, please, Bucky. My question is this, and it sort of follows up on Robert's question. The community organizations that I belong to, APEC, Virginia Organizing, I'm not even going to mention the Democratic Party because I don't consider myself a Democrat. I'm a progressive. We all focus on issues. We're very issue driven. But when it comes to making a real difference in the lives of individual members, by and large, not so much, unless it's, getting somebody registered to vote or very specific actions like that. What I see you suggesting, Anthony, is that our organizations try on a large scale to actually make a difference in the lives of our community on a micro level. Am I putting that correctly, albeit in jargon?
Yeah, that's it, Kel. Absolutely. And I'm not suggesting we abandon the fights or anything else. You're not suggesting that either. It's sort of expanding our portfolio because it's the right thing to do. It will help build our community. And also eventually, I don't know how long it's going to take, but eventually it'll be a lot harder for people to hate us when they see the good works we're doing in the community, to dismiss us as out-of-touch elites. That's the strategic dimension of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're spot on.
I've been trying to get that going for a while. Oh, and the easiest way to get that done is to go up to somebody and just say, hey, how you doing? And are you all right? And is there anything I can do to make your life better?
Yeah.
John.
Anthony, I want you to help my skepticism here. I think each and every one of your suggestions is spot on, and inherently are good things to do. For example, a pharmacy project will make people more well-fed. Weatherization will keep them warmer. But on a national level, how do we do more than make more well-fed, warmer Trump voters? Because my concern is that we might be more likable after we do this, but it may not translate on a national level. Because I think many white rural voters are perhaps not as motivated by economic concerns as they are by identity politics, their identity, our identity as white folks who live in the country. How do we scale that up? And is it going to take a generational change for that to see come to fruition?
Well, I mean, I sure don't know, but the premise, the sort of underlying premise of what I've said over these last 2 weeks, it's kind of the premise of my life, actually. So there's a lot at stake here for me, John. The underlying premise is that we need both. We need major state, national, and international action. We need better policies if we're going to solve climate change at all before it's just way too late. We're going to need dramatic shifts in policy, priority, institutional relationships if we're going to tackle inequality, which is insanely out of control and is destroying the society in so many ways. We need all of that. We don't get that We don't get that kind of radically good policy that would be good for the common person, good for most everybody, except maybe the very wealthiest and the biggest corporate polluters. We don't get that for a variety of reasons, one of which is we have one party that utterly resists it, the Republicans that are completely enamored with the elites and the economic elites and powers. And we have another party that fights them but comes down in this lukewarm center that even when we're in power, whether it's Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, or Barack Obama, the best we do is very slow incremental progress on those big problems. So we're not tackling the big problems. And part of the reason we're not tackling the big problems, part of the reasons the Democrats have become such pansies about it all, just so pathetically weak about it all, in my assessment, is because of this fear of working people, fear of the common woman and man, of people in rural areas. And that's what drives this centrism. And so I think the Democrats at one level know that we have a real reputation and image problem with working people, but we don't know how to address it. So what I'm saying is, these steps, first of all, the thinking differently part is basically coming to grips with the fact that we've been going down the same path for 40 years and it just hasn't worked. The acting differently is not an abandonment of those big ideas, but a sense that we need to aggressively and systematically across the country start working to make our communities better, and that in the process, I believe we'll begin to rebuild trust, and in rebuilding trust, gain allies, so that then the big solutions won't just be coming from and supported by highly educated urban liberal elites, but they'll have a broad base of support among working people and union people, because they'll no longer dismiss us as elites that don't understand them and can't trust us. And they'll begin to see some of and our policies and ideas will change as well. So that's my thought. The bottom-up piece is about building better communities because we desperately need to do these things, and about rebranding what it means to be a liberal and progressive, so that we can begin to get a broader net that we're casting. I think that will enable the big steps at the national level. I mean, it's a gamble, but Lord knows we've been doing the same thing for a long time, and my thinking, it hasn't worked very well.
I agree. And again, I think the suggestions are spot on.
Is there anyone else that hasn't spoken yet that wanted to make a comment or ask a question?
Are you hearing us?
Yes.
Okay, I've had my hand up for ages, and now I'm not sure what I was going to say.
Oh, okay.
But you could call on me, and I would try.
I call on you.
Okay. So is Anthony coming back?
I'm here.
Okay, there you are. So, so I've been in Abingdon for about 6 years, and I came to be part of Elder Spirit, and that didn't quite work out. So I ended up in a house in the neighborhood. And basically what happened is I lost my car. Young driver in a crash. Car wasn't, I couldn't replace it. So, I've been sequestered a lot, even before COVID. It's just more of the same for me. I stopped going to the farmer's market maybe 3 years ago because I couldn't get a ride. I actually talked to somebody from the farmer's market about, at some other gathering in the community, about this kind of issue, about there's no transit. There is none on Saturday and Tuesday. I could get in the last half hour, but had to go really fast and had to be exactly the same time. And if I had anything going on that night, anything else, well, it just didn't work. So I just gave up. I did ride transit when the transit routes got changed, it became really difficult even to do anything on transit because it just took too long. To go to the doctor was a 5-hour trip in town because he's at the other end of the town. So there was a lot of things like this. I actually have a lot of experience in it, and sort of have the sense that, you know, if I don't have my own income and am kind of middle class-ish and can just do things on a volunteer basis, I don't count. Now, the other thing with this is that I've talked to various people who didn't even know the farmers market exists. So there's some barriers that really need to be taken into account. And what I haven't had is some kind of group that would provide family support, essentially.
She tried to be part of Elder Spirit and it didn't work.
Right.
Now she's in a house. She lost her car.
Right. So, I mean, I have found other, you know, I think there are other people around. There are other people who have
A little pattern there, huh? Yeah.
Marty and Joanne, if you could mute, or I'm hearing you kind of talking over, and then we'll just let Anita finish. Go ahead, Anita.
So, so I think that there are other people. Of course, with COVID, it's not easy to get out, but it's not easy to get out also on foot. And if there's no kind of group that's supportive, that doesn't expect everybody to be able to totally, completely support themselves and come just volunteer their time. So how do family expansions work within this group that you're talking about so that more people can actually be involved who really can't be involved now?
Well, that's, I don't know that I have an answer for that, Anita. I mean, what I'm suggesting here is maybe that existing groups think about some new activities and new ways of going about some of their activities, whether that group is APEC, whether that group is Young Appalachian Patriots, whatever. And part of my suggestion is that have a political component, in the sense that they're deliberately trying to reach and break down some of these barriers that create the divide. Now, in the process, could and should those groups also take account of some of the issues that you're bringing up about lack of access, whether it's transportation limitations or things like that? Definitely that could be part of the kind of expanded strategy. But I don't know enough about how to go about that, and I think that's a level of detail about kind of local organizing that we're not trying to grapple with here. It's obviously a serious issue, but it's kind of a particular issue around how we go about organizing so that people can be engaged regardless of their means and regardless of their sort of mobility. I get that, but I think that's a slightly different question.
Well, we are talking, though, about people doing things in a different way, not just a different project, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It could be part of a different way.
And I am saying that this is a different way of thinking in terms of like normal community forms, rather than, you know, just we have this volunteer group that we just think about this and we go out and I think it's a different way of thinking about how the community works and how communities within the community interface and so on.
Agreed.
So I'm just saying I would be happy to have, you know, a conversation about anything like that, you know, at any time with anyone. Otherwise, I'm off here on the mountain by myself.
All right. Anyone else have anything they want to say?
Are we signing off otherwise, or are we still in discussion? How long does this last? Sorry.
You know, I haven't even checked the time. It's 8:08.
Yeah, we still have time. If you have the energy, I have the time.
Well, while people are thinking, I've got a comment I want to make, and Anthony, I have talked to you about this, but I'll try to say it in another way. John Gifford made me think about it when he made his comment. It seems to me that over the last 40 years, liberals and progressives have, when they have tried to work together, they have looked at things to stop something bad, like you were mentioning, or improve things. And often they have succeeded. They've won battles. And during that same 40 years, the wealthy and the conservatives have focused on maintaining power. And they have sometimes lost battles, but what they have maintained has been power and control. It seems like that's something we need to figure out how to address. And now since you were talking about specifics, speaking about specifics, one issue I've noticed is that rural areas don't have the power that urban areas have. And which means they don't get the resources that urban areas have. My specific focus has been social services. And what I see is that funding formulas coming out of the state ask Lee County to give the same kind of funds to get their money, the same percentage as Fairfax or the other wealthy counties. That's the kind of thing that goes on in the Department of Education too. So it seems to me that one thing we could be doing is to work with people that don't consider themselves progressives to say rural communities need a type of equity related to the urban, in relationship to the urban areas, and take on those kinds of fights in unison with our neighbors.
I mean, I think that's right, and you've mentioned that to me before, Bucky. It certainly, I agree with you 100%. I don't know it like you do, but whether you're talking about housing, education, healthcare services, child and protective, mental health, et cetera, no question about it that rural areas are generally worse off and shortchanged compared to urban areas. No doubt about it. I think within the class of folks that run the agencies or work in the agencies that provide those services, they all know it too. And I think their politics kind of covers the spectrum. I think maybe the leadership probably tends towards maybe moderate Democrats as a rule. No, you're saying no, not even. But so, if I think that's a good place, if that's true. I know certainly there's plenty of conservatives among teachers and as well. So I think that is a good place to make common cause. I think that's still a kind of a different layer from the average person who at this point has kind of embraced a doctrine that says, we don't want any of that government stuff. Now, they may well themselves be getting some of those government supports in one way or another, whether it's Medicare, VA, et cetera. But I don't think it's a persuasive argument to the average farmer, logger, miner, factory worker, working person to argue that we need to get our fair share of what Richmond and Washington have, because I think they have adopted the point of view as on the whole that they don't want any of that. But I think in terms of building common cause with people who are in the agencies, who are the kind of the local professionals, that is a good place to start and try to build coalitions. One of the places.
Okay, I'm looking for hands raised. No new hands raised.
Lucky, you know, I always have questions. This is
Okay, Robert, go for it.
this is one of the things I'm learning at school is to be patient and let other people talk. I'm very
Do you get a grade for that?
we'll talk about it offline. So, you know, Anthony, I in my own organizing have been inspired by the Black Panther Party because they were doing radical political work, but at the same time, they were building free breakfast programs. They were opening up hospital clinics. They were doing all of this like deep community wellness work. And in one way, Appalachian Voice, I'm Appalachian, the Young Appalachian Patriots, that's what we were thinking of doing and trying to model ourselves on. You know, we started with addiction and needles and resources like that. So I definitely see the paradigm that you're talking about. I'm wondering, a lot of what you were saying sort of focused on the environment. Even like the pharmacy program had this layer of environmental justice to it. So I'm wondering if you believe we should start there, or if there is another place that we might be able to start in our community, like some low-hanging fruit. And then the other piece of that same question is, where do you see like churches? And I think I'm just going to say churches because I think we can be honest about where we are in our own communities. Like, how do we either get ministers or congregations to be a part of this? Even, for example, that pharmacy program, right? Like, how do we get our own folks to walk into like a Baptist church out in the middle of nowhere and say, hey, I don't know if y'all know about a pharmacy program where if you have this coupon, you can go get these things. So this is my question is all wrapped together, but thank you.
Yeah, a lot of good points in there, Robert, and I appreciate your thinking on all of this stuff because you're always kind of ahead of me on your thinking. I would say a couple things in response. First, I think it's really good that you bring up the Black Panther model, where on the one hand, they had an extraordinarily radical social and political analysis, but they didn't wait for that to come to pass. They worked on building better communities, simultaneous, maybe with the same degree of resources and energy. I don't know about that, but both of those were obviously critical. Most of the American public, the white American public, only knew about their radical political agenda and obviously misunderstood it primarily as well. But even so, had no knowledge that they were actually putting their money where their mouth was and creating opportunities and structures that in communities that lacked it. The closest thing that I'm aware of, and I'm sure there's other examples I'm not thinking of, but one that comes to mind, I'll say immediately, of recent vintage in our area is Appalachian Voices. So Appalachian Voices, and I'm sure some of you are members, started out primarily as an environmental advocacy group, mostly around mountaintop removal and coal pollution, coal environmental issues. That continues to be a major piece of what they advocate for, where their lawsuits go, their newsletters and educational resources. But again, maybe not simultaneous, but a few years in, Appalachian Voices decided, we need to start trying to build the better alternative we talk about right here. And so they've created programs. Their New Economy Network in Southwest Virginia is one example, with a focus on solar, where they are actually trying to build out a better, healthier economy in the region while they continue to advocate in a variety of ways and organize in a variety of ways for policy change and political change. So they maybe are the closest that I'm aware of to something like the Black Panther Party. But I think both of them show that we don't have to choose. Whether it's the same organization doing both or a group of organizations and businesses that together take on both the building the better alternative right here, right now, and working for the kind of radical systemic change we need. They're not mutually exclusive, and when you link them, you get better policy and better action, is my thinking on that. In terms of churches, you know, I worked for the Catholic Diocese for 10 years, and that was kind of I did a number of different things not related to churches, but I also, a chunk of my time when I worked for the diocese was basically trying to motivate Catholic people and some other denominations to get engaged with the community, whether it was helping at the picket lines when the Pittston strike happened, or other kinds of things that we were engaged in, like starting our home ownership program and other things like that. My experience is that a lot of the mainstream sort of quasi-liberal churches are so small that the main limitation seems to be that they feel that they just don't have the people or the resources. But what you're suggesting, and that's not true across the board, but that was my experience. But what you're suggesting, that we go to maybe not the mainstream quasi-liberal churches, but go to the Baptist or the Pentecostal church with a suggestion looking for their engagement with something like the pharmacy program or something of that sort, you know, that could be quite amazing. That could really open some doors, broaden the base. I think it's definitely worth looking at.
Can I real quick? I was going to say, I'm very excited about this work and on board. And I am involved in some local ministerial associations that I have contacts with most of the pastors in the region. And then I'm not as well connected broadly, but I know people who are, that would probably be willing to help spread the news for something like a pharmacy program. There's also some small grants in the Episcopal Church that are available right now. If there was, if $1,000 or a little more would help in this work, I'd be, excited to help put together a grant application for some funds to do this work. But the deadline is approaching.
That's fantastic, Boyd. Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be wonderful.
Kel, go ahead.
My question, I've been trying, like Robert, to practice respectful listening. My question, as I've been listening to this call and looking around the room, is Robert's by far the youngest person on the call, then followed maybe by Philip and Edgar, Boyd, and maybe lastly me. I don't know. I don't no longer qualify as young. But how do we get young people into this work? Because if we can't get them interested in it, I'm sorry, we're all going to die soon. Well, maybe not soon, but come on. We need young people. How do we recruit them, Anthony?
Cal, doggone it, I wish I had an answer to that. I mean, I myself and a few other people on this call have made whatever attempts, however well-informed or poorly informed they were, to do just that over the last several years. Steve Fisher and I think it was either Reese or Bucky just a few years ago started a group that was intergenerational progressives with a specific goal of opening the space, creating the space for younger progressives to move in and kind of take over, to take leadership, but at the same time to be available with whatever wisdom was accumulated to provide, some mentoring, some assistance, some support. There was a number of meetings around that. There was energy when Occupy took off, and we had not only a group in Johnson City, but a local group in Abingdon that for a couple of months caught fire and was full of young people, probably as many or more than us old timers. It fizzled. After my first run for Congress, I created a group in 2014 with a few local people you all would know, that was the Young Rural Progressives. I mean, all I can say is several of us have tried and we just don't know how to do it. I mean, honestly, that's the bottom line. It is enormously frustrating and totally perplexing to me. I don't understand why it's so difficult, because there's no question that as a group, millennials and I guess it's Generation Z, younger people, are more progressive overall, embrace these issues and questions and these concerns more proportionately than our generation. They also, as a group, in my experience, love to do practical stuff. They want to make a difference in their community. They don't want to just talk about stuff. They want to act. So it seems like all the ingredients are there, and yet this call and most of what we all do is frequented by gray-haired people. And I'm out of ideas. I think it's an incredibly important question, and I just don't know what to do.
I mean, the only groups I know that have actual young people in them are the local young BLM movement.
Yeah.
And boy, those people are catching fire.
Yeah.
How long will it go?
So, oh well, I just thought I'd ask. Thank you.
No, it's critical. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
We're working and we're quite busy, but we are here and we are organizing. And you're exactly right, Kel. I think that this summer we saw young people again show up and support BLM and all of the work that's being done. Young people get the itch and they start building their own organizations and trying to talk to themselves as well. So you were all young once, and you were all doing this work when you were young, and now you're doing this work when you're you have more time and maybe when you're retired. So be kind to us young folks. We're out here, we're doing it. We're just not on this call right now.
Robert, I feel it's very ironic because I still can remember in the 60s, a group of us teens and 20-year-olds sitting around saying, where are all the old people? We need to get the old people active. And we couldn't find any old people to work with us.
I love it, Bucky. Well, it's almost 8:30. I don't know if there's any other questions, comments, insights. I would say that just from my point of view, the only other thing I hope some of the folks on the call will do is I hope you will dive a little deeper into the guidebook. There's really just some extraordinarily insightful thinking among the many articles in there. And if you know of other spaces, other organizations that would be open to this, that might host a 1, 2, or 3-part series to bring this conversation. I'm basically trying to plant seeds of a new way of thinking that I then hope lead to a new way of acting and talking. So any of you all who you're part of networks, you're part of larger organizations, please think about that and don't hesitate to share this stuff and see if we can't get it in more places.
All right. Anthony, thank you very much for doing 2 presentations. I see thumbs up.
Thanks, Anthony.
You bet.
So Bucky, just really quickly, Anthony, how do we get in touch with you? You're in mute.
Right. Sorry. There's my email. Bucky has it, but I'll say it now. And if you don't get it, then you can always get it from Bucky. It's my last name, Flacavento.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't remember how to spell it, there's still a few bumper stickers you can look at. Flacavento at Rural Scale, RURALSCALE.com.
Okay, super great.
And Kel is typing it into the chat as we speak.
Okay, cool.
By the way, I'll mention for the people that are still here, our Martin Luther King Planning Committee has already begun meeting, and we have chosen, which I think is a really interesting theme for this year. It's going to be, where do we go from here, chaos or community? That's the title of Martin Luther King's very last book before he was assassinated. And the question, it seems to me, is as relevant today as it has ever been, to think we do need to choose between chaos and community. So look for more information about events. Boyd has already developed the plans to have a really exciting speaker. Boyd, tell us who it is.
The speaker is Ruby Sales, and she was involved with with the original civil rights activism in SNCC and the Highlander School, and she was the one that was with the Episcopal seminarian Jonathan Daniels when he was assassinated or killed for trying to register voters, and was involved in the march to the Selma March and those sort of things. And she's still very active, and she's been on a lot of neat recent podcasts, like On Being with Krista Tippett. And if you she's very active on social media too, and has some very powerful posts recently as well. Ruby Sales.
And one of the other things I'll mention, in case you're part of any group that might be interested, Reese Hill has offered to have printed 5 new banners for our march, and we are looking for designs, and we're asking organizations if they would like to submit a design, student groups, church groups, youth groups, any or just a person. If you want to submit a design, easiest thing tonight is just to say, get in touch with me if you're interested in that, and I'll send you more details. So thanks to everybody for joining us tonight, and I hope we can have another event like this soon.
And
Thank you.
Bucky, how do we get the recordings?
Anthony
So
is going
yeah, I've
to
recorded
send
it.
that,
I
will.
Oh, okay.
I will upload it to my website. My daughter actually will do that. And then Bucky will send out a link to everybody.
Yeah, and we'll have it on Facebook or the email that I send out. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you so
Thank you,
much.
Anthony, Bucky.
Bye.